Everyone, and welcome to our discussion today on the topic of social labs and collaborative approaches to systems change. We're blessed today to have a fantastic panel with us, each with a range of different experiences on this subject, but also that span a wide range of sectors as well. And so I just wanted to first start off by thanking all the guests for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Ron.
Good to be here.
Great to have you. And so I'll introduce the guests shortly, but first just to start off with outlining the structure of the event today. And so after some short introductions, we'll have around an hour or so of a panel discussion on the topic of social labs and collaborative approaches to systems change. And then this will be followed by about 15 minutes at the end of live Q&A. If you have any questions, please do post them in the YouTube comments and we'll try to get around to those as best we can towards the end. And so onto the topic today. I really wanted to keep this bit brief so we can leave plenty of time for discussion. But part of why I think this topic is so important right now is that many of the most pressing challenges that we face today, whether that's inequality, environmental challenges, or financial instability, for example, are all incredibly complex and can't be tackled, as we know, by any one organization or any one stakeholder group. And so it seems evident that it requires the collaboration and the effort of many. And one approach to this has been creating open spaces that bring the relevant participants together, provide them with the tools and the methodologies and to guide them through an experimental process for them to understand the issues they face and start to collaboratively build new solutions. And so in this live discussion, we will be looking to explore collaborative approaches to systems change, in particular, the idea of social labs, variously referred to as systems innovation labs, living labs, change labs, co-labs, social labs, a lot of different ways of describing this, but it can be thought of as a way of doing social innovation and systems change in practice through creating platforms for collaboration. And so on that note, it's with great pleasure that I introduce the guests today. First off, we have Zaid Hassan, who is the CEO of 10 in 10. He's also the book of The Social Labs Revolution. Zaid is a highly experienced facilitator who has over 15 years of experience supporting multi-stakeholder innovation, working with governments, civil society, and corporations. Some recent clients include the World Bank, the UN Foundation, Oxfam, the governments of New Zealand and Canada. Next up, we have Charlotte Hochman, who is founder of WOW Labs. Charlotte has spent the last 15 years building capacity for social innovation in civil society, the private and the public sectors. Her expertise is in developing tools and projects to catalyze people's capability to innovate and create startups in response to global challenges. She's the co-founder of WOW Labs and Place, which is a hub built to change the narrative around refugees by linking migration to innovation and the future of work. Next up, we have Russ Gaskin, who is the managing partner of Co-Creative. Russ helps people who don't know each other and often don't even like each other solve complex problems together. His team at Co-Creative currently supports 18 multi-stakeholder innovation networks working on challenges like sequestering atmospheric carbon through agriculture, aligning bank lending with climate realities, closing racial equity gaps in health and education, and shifting upstream determinants of health. And finally, we have Stephanie Daniels, who is the Senior Program Director of the Sustainable Food Lab. Stephanie manages Food Lab impacts and learning partnerships focused on living income, sustainable livelihoods, and climate resilience. Her expertise is in responsible sourcing from smallholders in developing countries. And before joining the Food Lab, Stephanie founded and led Sustainable Supply, which provided strategic advice to large corporations and leading NGOs on ethical supply chain development. Stephanie was also a leadership fellow of the Academy of Systemic Change. And so to kind of start with the first question, I think it would be really good for the audience today as well. Some people who might be new to this, if Zaid, you could start off by describing what the notion of the social labs means, and then for the other panelists as well, and maybe starting with Stephanie, to what extent does this notion that Zaid puts forward kind of converge or diverge with each of your own current approaches towards collaborative approaches to systems change?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. Maybe just to start with a little bit of background, and I can just segue into the question. So my background is I've been working on challenges that are kind of complex for the last 20 odd years. And, you know, when I first started doing the work, my assumption sort of in the early 2000s was that I am going to go and learn from people who've been doing this a lot longer than I have, and then I'll know how to do this stuff. And what I realized very quickly was that our approach, if you like, to complex challenges and our approach to complexity is very immature. It's a very nascent kind of field. We haven't been doing it that long. Many of the kind of tools and approaches we have towards tackling it are new in some ways. So the labs work, if you like, came out of that understanding that the field we're in is kind of immature. Nobody really knows the answer for how to do it. And it's a rapidly maturing field. So really, my work has involved helping figure out how to mature that field. And part of that has been kind of naming things, if you like. So, you know, what do we call things, and how do we name things? And really, the idea with social labs was that, you know, we have labs in the natural sciences. So we have scientific labs, we have physics labs and chemistry labs, and that those things are designed to address and tackle, you know, biology problems or physics problems, natural science problems. We need social labs as a counterpoint to tackle challenges that are social in nature. So that was kind of that's been the broad kind of frame, if you like. And one way of understanding what a social lab is that it's simply a strategic response to a complex challenge. And another way of understanding it is that it's a practice. And we've been maturing that practice over the last kind of 20 years. So there's been a broad field of people doing that. And, you know, the food lab has been really central part of that, WOW labs and so on. So the way I kind of understand practice is that, you know, the analogy is, if you like, with cooking. So if you think about cooking as a practice, you can think about all the elements you need in order to cook. So you need, you know, you need ingredients, you need pots and pans, you need a place to cook, a kitchen, and you can put those ingredients together and produce something. You can produce different cuisines. And ultimately, you know, like cooking, the practice, if you like, the test of the practice is, does anyone want to eat what you cook, basically? So if you're going to cook up a strategy, does anyone want it? And what's the process of cooking it? And you know, the difference between a practice and a process is quite significant. So quite often people approach social labs as if it's a process. But the analogy is sort of, that's a bit like approaching cooking as if it's frying. You know, so obviously cooking involves many different types of processes, you know, frying and baking and so on. And similarly, the way I kind of see social labs is that it's a practice, and within that practice, there are many different processes, there are many different tools, there are many different ingredients we can use. And it's a practice of trying to figure out how to respond or tackle complex social challenges. And the work really has been maturing that practice over the last few years, and the practice is changing, therefore. So it's not static. It's not that, you know, we have a 9-step process and that's the process and there we are. So the nature of the work is also changing as we learn more and more about complexity and complex challenges. And I use kind of 3 criteria to define the work, which are very broad kind of criteria. So the first is that the work is social, that it involves people that are being impacted by the challenges we work with, as well as practitioners, policy experts, people at multiple levels of the system working together to come up with responses. And that, for me, is probably the most difficult part of the practice, which is, you know, how do we constitute teams of people that are genuinely diverse, that come from different levels of the system, that aren't just all economists, all designers, or all, you know, practitioners. And then the second characteristic is that the work is experimental. And what that means very simply is it's trial and error. We try something out, we see if it works, we iterate it and change it. And then the final thing is that the work is systemic. And my understanding of systemic is that we are trying to figure out how to deal with causal root kind of determinants of a situation, not simply the symptoms of a problem. So that implies a whole load of things in terms of how we do that. How do we understand the root causes and the social determinants of these issues? But for me, those are the three kind of broad characteristics of the practice. And then the form the practice takes can vary quite dramatically, and does, as you said, there are different types of labs and so on. So that's how I understand the work, and it's still immature, still kind of maturing. We've still got a long way to go. So I'll kind of stop there, I think.
Sounds great. Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, curious, based on kind of what Zaid's shared there, kind of what overlaps or kind of differences do you see, Stephanie, in your own practice in this field?
Thanks, Rowan. And yeah, thank you, Zaid. It's great to listen to you. And one of the reasons I wanted to participate in this is we don't always have chances to step away from our practice and be with people who are sort of sharing some of the same practices, but in different contexts. It's really interesting to reflect on your definition. And I do think the concept of a lab is quite important in the aspect of experimentation and testing, so prototyping and testing. And the food lab came out of, we were founded in 2003, out of a group of really systems dynamics modelers, as well as people interested in applying some of the research on scaling sustainability in mainstream food and agriculture systems. So there was both a content interest as well as a process interest, and we continue to bring those two pieces together. And one of the things I think that I really resonated in your definition was this providing a space in which you can bring a diverse and ideally influential group of actors in a system. So ideally you can name that system together and sense together what is the questions and the focus you want to work on together. So in the sense of the cooking analogy, in the food system work we do is sort of what is the question that we can't solve alone? So is it about how we feed people? Is it about how we tackle the greenhouse gas emissions of agriculture, or whatever the content question is, but really sense the question. So versus a change project that might have the question already preformed, that process of together sensing the current status, the current reality, and thinking about the future vision is really a big part of what we do, and the sort of role we think we play, linked to many other sort of platforms in food and agriculture, which there are many. And I think, yeah, so we can talk more about how we do that in certain processes that we integrate in, but I think that I'm really interested in distinguishing between practices and process, and that process for us has some principles, around inclusiveness as much as we can. So having the process be structured in a way that we think about how different, we're really conscious of who comes into the room or who comes into a conversation, and making sure that it really is inclusive, recognizing that it's always very difficult. There are always power dynamics in any group of people, but making them as visible and as kind of visible and perhaps in a way put aside so that people can actually enter the room. And yeah, I'll stop there so other people can comment.
Brilliant, thank you. And now Charlotte, would you like to go next?
With pleasure, thank you for having me. I guess building on this common landscape, which is emerging from the conversations, I would say that we focus. We have a take on the topic, which is really linked to space, and I'll tell you why we came to that specialization in a way, or expertise. It's precisely what you were saying, Stephanie, towards the end, which is who's showing up in these labs, in these spaces, in these experiences, in these processes. As Zaid was saying, the composition of the group is crucial in the outcome, like any experiment. And our experience working in many times unstable or extreme contexts, which means either contexts where there's, for economic reasons, some kind of instability or emergence or risk, or for political reasons or reasons of cultural norms as well. So we've been kind of specializing in these kinds of contexts in different countries on different continents. And in these contexts specifically, the question of who shows up to something that you call lab or any other kind of practice is a little bit frustrating, or that was our starting point. You know, the people who you managed to bring around to discuss the challenge at hand had little exposure to the challenge at hand. There were power dynamics that were completely outside of our control, and the context, I would say, of that work unfolding, or of that process unfolding, which Zaid and Stephanie were talking about, for us didn't reflect what needed to happen, in fact, for the challenge to be really solved. And the main reason was that people with less power, to use, you know, blatant words, people with less power were invited to the table, but the table wasn't being redefined. You know, there were guests at the table. And, you know, I can give you an example. We were working in Malaysia, in the northern part of the country, in a region called Kelantan, which is a very conservative Muslim state. And we were working with the Obama administration and other stakeholders to try and encourage the innovation produced by the youth there. So basically trying to help the youth to be able to propose different types of solutions for their own needs. And our task was to create the condition for that to happen. So having a lab approach, we convened the private sector, so the industry, which kind of needed the youth to be. The local government, because it's very far from KL, from Kuala Lumpur, so the regional government was more relevant than the national one. The US Embassy, because that's what we were working with as well as an asset, and the university, where we decided to actually create the physical space for the experiment. And the part of the university that we chose was actually on the border of the campus, very close to the villages, which was the immediate context. And I'm giving this example because all these actors that I just cited are somehow the ingredients or the forces at play in the outcome, right? They're all required for the outcome to work. And we became interested in this notion of space and of cultures as well. So we work a lot with cultural norms, because we found that unless the space, now it can also be a digital space, of course, but unless the space looks and feels like what you're trying to solve, the conversations and the processes are always going to be very biased towards the people in the power in the system that have the oldest power, in a way. So that's the aspect that I'm most interested in within experimentations. You know, what are the variables? What can you play with in practice? What are the limits of, you know, processes like design and many others that we all use on a daily basis, but that have very strong dynamics as well, that create a certain passivity or reproduce certain structures of power that we are all uncomfortable with. But how do we move beyond that in practice? You know, what's our margin? What are the new conversations that need to happen? Who's there? And who will be there tomorrow to continue that kind of work as well?
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. I already see quite a bit of overlap, but yeah, there's different kind of emphases as well. Yeah, Russ, curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, Bo, and the same thing was striking me because Zaid, you gave such a nice, open, inclusive definition that there's lots of room to play. And I think that's what's happening in the field, is we're seeing different expressions of I think, different focuses that people bring or different orientations. So I don't know how our approach at Co-Creative might diverge or vary from a typical social lab. We refer to the work that we do as collaborative innovation, and we often call these groups innovation networks. What we're seeing in the field, and some of this comes from gatherings we've been doing with folks who are doing systems change work and building capacity in that field, is some of the differences are certain folks are focused much more on network weaving and the skills and competencies and practices around building effective networks and connecting people to learn together and to take action together. And some people are coming more from an orientation toward systemic analysis, systems thinking, system diagnostics, system dynamics, et cetera. And I think those are just two aspects of the same work in my mind. Maybe another way to express that is we see approaches that are more diagnostic, and we see other approaches that are more dialogic, which is really about two different ways that I think are very integral and interdependent, but two different ways of analysis and meaning making within systems. And then I think we see some variance in, is our approach kind of an open door approach where we're going to invite in a lot of difference in a system, and then we're going to work with all that difference and shape a shared intent and goal together? Or what we see, and this is more our orientation and our particular approach, is we start with an intent, and it might be in the form of a goal, and we'll start socializing that with people in the system, and we're looking to attract people who have that influence and represent a fractal of the larger system. And we want to connect those people into a change system together. And so I respect people who do the kind of open door approach. I think that's really, really challenging work, and it's really important. Our particular focus has been the cultivated network approach. But I think also there's, kind of riffing on what others were sharing, there's multiple levels of what we're doing too. At one level, we're addressing that systemic challenge or that systemic dysfunction that's been identified, that's systematically producing probably good outcomes, but also systematic harm, particularly to certain people or communities in the system. So that's one level of the work, is just we're addressing this challenge. Next level, which I'm really excited about, is building the change system and attracting more and more people into that, what's really, I think, a microcosm of the new emerging system. There's often a point in our networks where people look around and they say, wow, you know that system we've been talking about, that third horizon or whatever, this is it. What we're doing in this room, aligning around shared purpose, connecting and trusting relationships, learning together about ourselves and the dynamics within the system, making more integrated and more effective solutions together. This is the new system. So that's a moment that I love in the evolution of networks. And then I think beyond that, frankly, our hidden agenda at Co-Creative is cultural evolution. Yeah, we're working on these different issues. Yeah, we're connecting change systems, building capacity in the field, things like that. But at the end of the day, what we really get juiced by is helping us to evolve as a species. And frankly, the climate work is hopefully ensuring that we're around long enough for that evolution to happen. But I get most excited when I see that transformation happening within individuals and groups.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a rich kind of variety of perspectives on this issue. And, you know, yeah, Russ, you something that really struck me about what you said was kind of this idea of the creating these networks of trust. but also that once you find the shared purpose, you start spreading that around, that you start to almost find this attractor effect, and you start to kind of see this momentum. And also, Charlotte and Stephanie, you were talking about kind of the importance of identifying, maybe not just identifying, but making sure that you have the right representation of people from the outset, because if that isn't there, then how can you kind of expect the whatever comes up to be kind of representative or inclusive? And yeah, thank you very much for that. And one thing that I think will be quite relevant to a lot of people who are practicing in this field, and because it doesn't obviously just apply to people who are creating social labs, it's, you know, anybody who needs to kind of collaborate with other people to solve complex problems, which, you know, is I'm sure a lot of us. And in these kind of environments, given the diverse backgrounds and perspectives that are often found in these types of multi-sector, multi-stakeholder collaboration spaces, what practices have you found useful to foster cohesion and collaboration within these groups? Maybe we could start with Stephanie with this one, and moving on to Russ and Charlotte and Zaid, if that's all right.
Sure. So for the food lab, we started with a practice and have continued it over the years of learning journeys, of small group learning journeys. And this is a practice I think a number of different labs use now, but it's putting together very consciously a small group that is mixing sort of diverse, influential in different ways, a group of actors in a particular system. In this case, we were talking about food and agriculture broadly. So we weren't saying people who work in dairy or people who work in, you know, any particular thing, but more sort of people focused on how do we decrease the negative impact of agriculture and increase positive impact. And taking them before we do anything on the content is getting out in the dirt, is sort of recognizing that once we get out behind our desks, once we kind of particularly get outside and have a sort of curated process together, it really changes the dynamic. And then you can enter into a more structured conversation in a different way. And we take people out to a particular landscape or geography and ask them to really sense, just really listen, and not, even if they are experts in one aspect of the system or know it very well, but we give them a very simple methodology to be aware of your assumptions, write them down, and then think about what might be some questions you have for this person. And we sort of work with the hosts to have kind of a thoughtful listening conversation. And it is striking the change in dynamic between the participants. So the people that then enter into a bigger meeting have a quality of relationship. So we usually have about a third of our bigger meetings that go on these learning journeys, and even just 30% of people that establish a personal kind of good dynamic, they bring that into the larger meeting. So that's one of our core practices.
Thank you. And on to you, Russ.
I think what we do around the diversity is, and I would agree with the emerging theme there, diversity is the fuel of everything in this work. It should fuel the analysis, the strategy design, the prototyping and development of interventions and solutions. So the capabilities around harnessing the benefits of diversity, including, you know, generating productive conflict or things like that, I think those are really key to success in the work. We have 6 patterns that we talk about in this work. And some of those relate to how we work effectively with diversity. One of them is leveraging tensions, which comes out of the field of polarity thinking. But it's identifying and working productively with the values tensions that show up. So in a network, we support that's working on eliminating worker exposures to hazardous chemicals in the electronic supply chain. There was a real tension between, do we focus on hazard or do we focus on safety? So do we focus on reducing the hazardous content of these cleaners and solvents and adhesives through green chemistry, things like that? Or do we focus on protecting workers through ventilation systems, PPE, things like that? There was another tension around why are we focusing on worker exposures in the factory and we're not focusing on environmental discharges of those chemicals? Because it doesn't make sense to protect workers in the factory and then they go breathe those chemicals in the air in their community or drink them in the water. And so those are more kind of practical tensions. But then we get into tensions like some people have a real valence and orientation toward moving to action. Other people have a real valence and value around reflection and analysis. And so those kinds of process tensions we name up front. So at a launch meeting for a network, every meeting thereafter, we will say, these are the 8 or 10 tensions that are going to be present in this work. And let's agree that we're going to leverage these productively together. One of the ones that came up around that was in the electronics collaboration called Clean Electronics, is the tension between quick wins and systemic change. Because the brands in the network were really pushing for quick wins. We need to show progress so that we can continue to get support from within our companies to participate and contribute to this work. And the NGOs, who are worker advocacy groups, campaign organizations, they were more adopting this view of quick wins, whatever, we need to change this whole system. We need to just fundamentally redesign the way electronics production is done. And so we literally mapped that polarity using a tool called a polarity map. And then people realized from the map, these two things are really interdependent. The quick wins will give us currency, they'll give us momentum, we'll get more folks to the table because we're showing progress. And all of those need to be accruing toward the systemic change strategy. Otherwise, we're just going to be doing the same kind of quick wins over and over for the next 20 years. So naming those tensions and working with those is one. Diverging and converging, being really clear with the group about when we're expanding our options, analysis, perspective, et cetera, and when we need to kind of integrate, converge, align, decide. That's another pattern. And then another one is what we call spiraling, which is we're really carefully starting with that initial intent. And then we're talking to a few people. We're seeing, does that have energy? Is there anything we might adapt about this? And then we're talking, maybe we talk to 2 people, then we talk to 4 people, those people engage 8 people. And so as we spiral out, we're getting more and more people whose interests and analysis, perspectives, experience are being integrated into the analysis and into the alignment of the intent. So spiraling is another pattern, I think, that really helps with the diversity. Of course, when you're doing that, you have to be careful not to water down the intent or analysis so that it becomes kind of a least common denominator, weak, intent and analysis. But those are a few patterns that we use around leveraging diversity.
Thanks, Ross. Yeah, one thing that stood out for me as you were saying that was this idea of, it's not short, quick wins versus systemic change. It can be, quick wins in the pursuit of something more systemic, but they don't have to be kind of mutually exclusive. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, on to you, Charlotte.
I think one thing around the whole diversity phrase even and topic in general is that I think there's an opposition in a way that comes up frequently between the mainstream and then diverse populations, which I think in terms even of framing of the question, is completely flawed, and it does create obstacles to actually creating a system that's representative of different points of view, different stories, different paradigms. So just to point out that even the word diversity is one that I'm not very comfortable with, that I don't use very much for this precise reason, because I find that it has just been misused in companies, for example, to talk about minorities, including women sometimes. I mean, the whole thing is just completely confusing to me. So I like to think of it in the context of our work and of any lab context or social experiment is more like biodiversity. Like, what are the different, what are the different categories of life somehow that need to be there? It's again coming back to the image of not inviting people to a main table, which is a table decided without them, but redefining the table itself. So behind that concept of diversity, I think are many other problems. I definitely join Russ in the importance of naming all the dynamics around these topics. That's something that we do as well with the groups and with the people who are involved in the experiences that we create, because I think there's a limit to how much kind of invisible engineering you can do in these contexts to try and tip the power balances. Or I think there's also a question of maturity of the system and of the people within the system who constitute the system on that topic. And I think Russ was talking about cultural evolution somehow before. It's exactly what we're talking about here, right? There's a fluency which I think we have to develop in many sectors around really seeing the lack of equity in the systems that we create, including many of the labs, if you don't specifically intervene for that to happen, for that equity to happen. So one methodology that we use, for example, is to make sure that since the very beginning, there are some people who would be, let's say, the opposite of the usual suspects in the situation. So the people who would not be maybe the first to be invited, but who in fact should be, because they would have most impact and they look more like the result that we want at the end. We make them, we give them key functions in the process since the beginning. So a trick, for example, is that we will train them on some of the most important conversations or methodologies, and they will be guiding the process for more established stakeholders within the process. For example, people who have more prestige or who have perhaps more education. That's something that we've been using. We started experimenting with that about 15 years ago when we started this practice. And it's something that we've never stopped doing. And we do it more and more. And we're doing it now with refugees, for example, in the context of this project that you were talking about, which is called Place. So, in that case, we will be training migrants, asylum seekers, refugees in service design or challenge-driven innovation processes, and they'll be working alongside us towards city officials or the private sector who need to innovate, so that some of these dynamics can be broken in practice, because it's very difficult to break them outside of practice. We've got such deeply entrenched ways of doing things, all of us. So we found that tricking people into new interactions is a very effective way of creating new behaviors, and that it's easier, in fact, to then retrospectively make sense of these experiences and therefore change, the theory or the habits, rather than go from theory to then practice. So that's something we've been using consistently. One thing that this approach enables us to do as well is to create common codes within the space, or within the mental space of the lab, the experiment, which are explicit and which are diverse in themselves. So, for example, we might, if we do decide to use English as the official language of the experiment, that will really be verbalized, explained, and addressed as a topic. But actually, I'm saying that, but we never have used only English as the main as the only language of the experiment. So it's a choice because the codes have to be at different levels, and it's important that the official codes of however the experiment works can already enable different ways of functioning. Language is one of them, but as Russ was saying, there might be a reflective mode, or people who are more action oriented. All these are perfectly legitimate, and it's important to address them and to establish as common codes or common ways of behavior within the experiment that are legitimate, that are valued, and that have words attached to them that people can refer to, and that people can also switch, try one that they're less comfortable in. The last aspect that I would say we use a lot to encourage that diversity in practice and within the experiments is paying particular attention to the storytelling that emerges from the experiment. Stories look like people, people create the stories that look like them, but many times the stories that emerge from experiments are stories of only a particular part of the people concerned. And I put in that category, for example, people who, stories that focus on beneficiaries or on people who are less represented, because that's still the point of view of someone within the system who is standing where they are standing. And we are trying to use different approaches to make sure that the voices that emerge from the system, from the experiment, and that create therefore the stories, including the official story of what happened in that experiment, these stories for them to be as varied as the points of view of people living through that experiment. And the points of view can be vastly different, from a city official to a corporate person who's never really seen any other organizational culture apart from the corporate world in any country, to someone who's just discovered such a process. To the narrative behind what happened and the significance of what happens in the experiment can't belong to one of the groups. And I've often been frustrated that even if the experience is complex and we manage to enable different types of behavior, without creating a sense of norm that is too strong within the experiment, the narration of the experiment and of its significance will still come back to one dominant voice. So I guess I would just say intentionality and caution on where the stories are born, who's telling them, and also to whom, because we all tend to talk to our own community, our own tribes. So that's also why, having a story in the mouth and through the eyes of someone who wouldn't normally tell the story, not as a beneficiary, but as a hero of the story, changes who the story gets to. And I think it's really important to get a very diverse community of people doing these experiments as well, leading them.
Yeah. Thank you. One thing that, that was quite rich for me was that it's not just necessarily about saying, for example, we want to make this open and just seeing who comes to the table and kind of taking that initial group as kind of, oh, great, well, we've kind of made it decentralized. This is what's happening. But it's almost taking more a proactive approach and saying, wait, maybe somebody hasn't come up, but maybe they should. And maybe we can actually be more proactive in providing some support so that they are able to, that it's more level on that side and being more proactive rather than just seeing who turns up and kind of going ahead with that. Thank you. And moving on to you, Zaida, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what practices you've used to help create this kind of coherence.
I'm going to be brief because I know we want to take some questions from the audience. So I think one thing that just came up for me listening to people is that I would kind of make a distinction between practice and technique. And I kind of feel that, what I see happening is that we, as a society, this is a generalization, are quite technique obsessed. So it's a bit like, look, tell me what the steps are to doing X, Y, or Z, and then I can do the steps as well. And what I would say is that the problem I think I'm seeing with that approach is that the example I would use is at one level, those techniques are things that we should hold very, very lightly, and they're contextually relevant or not. So Charlotte, lots of the examples you gave, what I was hearing you say is that, look, there are contexts and there are things that are appropriate to context, and we do things. If it's not English, it's got to be in this language, but there's contextual sensitivity in terms of why we do what we do and when we do it and so on. So the challenge that I kind of see is that there's a structural issue that I see. And the structural issue, I'm going to just very crudely kind of summarize it. So the way I see the structural issues playing out is that, what is happening with a lot of the strategies are people are kind of are being put into this position where they're saying, okay, look, you give me $1 and I'm going to add strategy to that, or practice or process or whatever you want to call it. And then I'll give you $1 million back in a week. And it's a bit like, that doesn't make any sense. If someone said that to you in practice, you'd be like, well, it's kind of a scam. And the problem with that situation is the strategy that you add to your inputs doesn't really matter. You cannot do it, basically. It's not practical. It's like, if I say to you, give me $1 and I'll give you $1 billion in a week, you'll say, no, you won't. And if I say to you, I've got this great kind of practice, you're still going to be like, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't matter what your practice is. You're not going to be able to give me that output. So partly I kind of think that, the structural issues have to be addressed, which is a bit like, why are those people not being able to turn up to the table? Why are they not there? And they're not there because they can't afford to be there. The incentives don't exist for them to be there. There's a structural, there's structural issues in terms of turning up and not turning up. So what I feel is that we're kind of band-aiding a lot of those structural issues without recognizing them. And I think that the problem really is our strategies, that, our strategies are underfunded, undercapitalized, under-resourced. We don't have the capacities. We're not able to hire the people, bring in the people that could do the work. There's not enough diversity in the people that we do bring in because, the people that we want to expand the work to can't afford to be there, basically. So I feel that unless we start dealing with the structural issues, the practices we use, quote, what I would call techniques, processes, are kind of irrelevant. It's like, you can't take $1, add practice to it, and then produce $1 billion and go, hey, presto. It's not magic, basically. So for me, like, without dealing with the issue of, what are the inputs that you're actually able to bring to the table, and those inputs are politically defined, we're constrained in the inputs that we're able to bring to the table because of the structural inequalities of the system. So the question for me is more, what do we practically do about those structural inequalities, about the limits of inputs, about people not being able to turn up to the table because they just can't afford to be there? And if we can tackle those things, then questions of practice and process and strategy and technique become interesting. But otherwise, they're not interesting for me. So I would stop there.
Thanks. Yeah, we've got about 12 minutes left before we need to move on to the Q&A. So maybe time for another. Yeah. I think one thing that might be interesting for audience members, because when we're trying to bring people together, we're part of kind of these collaborative environments, it can be messy in a way. Part of it, that's the fun, but it can be challenging as well. And, I'd be quite curious to hear from each of you, and maybe if you're able to just share kind of a short story of, any challenges or even failures that you've encountered along the way from doing these practices, and what you kind of learned from it, or how you maybe overcame it. Russ, would you like to start, and maybe we can move on to Charlotte, Zaid, and Stephanie?
It's a funny question, Bowen, because, and I might have even suggested it, but I did a webinar yesterday on the benefits of fear, conflict, failure, and resistance in this work. So I have a hard time thinking of anything that happened as a failure per se. But I think there is a learning from one of the networks we supported, where a couple years into the work, they were doing really terrific work. They had multiple interventions that were moving forward. It was a really excellent fractal of the larger field. This was in the agriculture space. And the energy started to wane in the group. And you could see that expressed in things like people aren't showing up as much as they did before for either maybe a network convening or more likely one of the initiative groups meetings, initiative groups being those tactical groups that are moving forward some of the specific strategies. And when we would talk to people, they were really excited about the work. The goal was really meaningful for them. They talked as if they were engaged. And we, at some point, did an intervention where we said, okay, what would it look like to really ramp up this work at the next level of impact and audacity? And we really stepped back from the original goal, the scope, everything, and we kind of reconnected people into a purpose for the network that was much bigger and more audacious and more game-changing than what they had done before. And it's interesting because we've seen that dynamic about a couple years into other networks. We start to see that kind of waning of energy, even though there's really terrific work happening. And I realized the metaphor for this is when I'm driving down the highway, I might be going 65 miles an hour here in the US. And but I don't feel like I'm going fast, because the only time I feel like the car is moving fast is when I'm accelerating. And so now we've gotten into this practice of about 2 years into a network's work. We've kind of throw something into the network to challenge the group to step up even bigger. And so with one of the networks we support is a network of 50 health systems here in the US that's working on economic determinants of health. And the challenge to that group was, okay, let's step up and make an investment commitment. So how many of the health systems are willing to allocate 1% of their investable assets to investments in low-income communities? And that was kind of throwing down the gauntlet to say, we're doing great work, we're making a lot of progress, we're seeing the metrics that we're focused on move, and we're seeing this being normalized across the sector. But let's get into some nitty-gritty commitments here. And about 15 of the systems stepped forward. They ended up collectively committing $800 million to investments in low-income communities. And now we're advancing a procurement commitment. And the larger goal of the network also is expanding and deepening as well. So I think there's something to keeping the energy going by deepening the commitment and the expressions of the commitment in the work.
Interesting, thank you. And yeah, Charlotte, on to you.
Similarly, I have difficulty to think about failures somehow. I don't know why. It must be it must be something in the way we think of our practices, because I mean there's many things to fix in what we do, but somehow the work is all about fixing them continuously and trying out stuff so that it's not a failure. So looking back, I don't see many failures, but I see so much effort in trying to get things right, little step at a time. I would say more generally that one of the things that I think in the past have limited the impact that I managed to have on the system was the point that I was making earlier about not being explicit about the things that do need to change in the system and that don't depend on us, and that we can't, push the buttons of within the experiment directly. We can't change those things. And yet they need to be addressed with common language. It doesn't matter the words, we can have several for the same phenomenon. We can have different ones in different sectors. It doesn't matter, but to name the dynamics that are at play, that are determining the way that people act or the power that people have in that situation. And I think that a large part, in fact, of what I believe in this work is that people take away with them from that experience of being a part of the group that vocabulary, that knowledge, these conversations that maybe they cannot have in their normal sector or in their normal work. And that is also part of moving forward the way that things work, because then they go back to their own sector and there are maybe some elements of language or ways of thinking about things that they were not even conscious they were missing. So, you know, creating new conversations, creating new codes during the experiment, even if there is no immediate outcome in the experiment on these topics, but creating a common culture, because many times it's very strategic people who are involved in these experiments, and they do have, you know, part of their learning is just grabbing things along the way and bringing them back to their organization. So I think that that's something that earlier on I was maybe overlooking the power of. I work a lot with universities, so a lot of these labs that I run are within universities and for students. And it's the same in that case. You know, how do you train a generation of young people, whether they're engineers or designers or computer scientists, or to have the language and the way of addressing the questions that are stuck in our system, that we cannot, you know, bring an immediate solution to, but that somehow the way of framing the question is already part of the solution. So it's not all about quick fixes, or the experimentation, I think, is also on a longer term through creating a culture of experimentation and open dialogue around some of the parts that are more tricky in the system and that these experiments can't change everything about, but we need people who can address them frontally, I think, if nothing else, mentally, you know, to address them, to be there mentally, to show up to these issues, even if then they decide to not act directly upon them, you know, in their normal job somehow.
Thank you. Yeah, Zaid?
So I think, you know, another way, I kind of tend to agree, we know with Ross and Charlotte that we have a particular way of looking at failure. So one way, you know, I look at it is that either nothing's a failure in the sense that, you know, we're learning from everything that we do, or everything's a failure, depending on the level that you're looking at, which is that, you know, everything we're doing, you know, fundamentally hasn't produced the, you know, the fundamental shifts that we want in society in terms of equity or climate or whatever it is. But in the sense that everything we're doing is succeeding because, you know, there's something that we're learning from it that is allowing us to improve the practice, and it's, you know, it's allowing us to move forward, really. So I think that in that sense, I don't think there are failures. I think that, you know, everything that we do, if we're reflexive in our practice, then we are learning from it and we're moving our practice forward. And obviously there's great value in that. So the way I see it is that the essence of the practice is a reflexive practice where, you know, we try things out, we see what happens, we learn from it, and we iterate and kind of grow, evolve the practice. And then on the other hand, I kind of think that the failures are more strategic failures, not necessarily failures in our practice, but, you know, think about the climate crisis, or we think about, you know, equity issues and so on, that many of those issues are kind of getting worse. And, you know, I remember when the Sustainable Food Lab actually started, a lot of those conversations were not possible, you know, so there wasn't a space to have conversations about the state of the food system because, you know, it was so dire that people were scared to actually raise these issues because, you know, if you're on the board of Unilever and you say, well, the food system is heading for catastrophe, that will impact your share price and so on and so forth. So, you know, I think there has been huge success in terms of creating those kind of spaces for conversations that really couldn't happen in the past. And to go, you know, to build on what Charlotte was saying about like being explicit about naming some of those things. So I think that that's happened on the one hand, that we've managed to create, I think, these spaces and sustain them. So, you know, the Sustainable Food Lab has been going for, you know, good decade and a half. And so the personally, the way I kind of see it is that the failures really are kind of at a structural level, again, to go back to what I was saying earlier. And, you know, this is a little bit, I'm going to stereotype a little bit, but, you know, the nature of the structural problems are a little bit like, you have a foundation with a large endowment. They send the endowment to Wall Street, they get a return from it, they take the return, so let's say they get 100 million back, and they split that return into tiny little chunks and then fund NGOs and say, look, we want you to tackle the climate crisis with these tiny chunks of money. And then you kind of go, wait a minute, what is your endowment actually being invested in? And then they kind of go, oh, we don't have any investment screens, so it's actually being invested in coal. And it's a little bit like, wait a minute, so you're sending, $5 billion to Wall Street to underwrite the problems, you're getting a return, and then you're breaking that return into tiny little chunks, and then you're funding all these nonprofits who all know that actually the scale of the problem is vast. And what? It just doesn't make any sense, right? So those structural problems are part of the challenge that I see. It's very difficult at the level of a practice or a process to shift those kind of structural issues. So the question for me again becomes, how do we do that? Because those failures are kind of writ large, right? Those failures are enormous, and obviously that's kind of shifting in terms of divestment campaigns and so on. All of these things are kind of shifting, but fundamentally, I think for me the question is, how do we finance, support, and grow the practice, basically, where the unintended consequences of having to grow that aren't, we're going to grow it through profits from, coal or oil or whatever it is, right? It doesn't make any sense. So for me, there's massive structural failures in how we're organized, and those structural failures need to somehow be tackled, because if we don't tackle them, the returns from financing coal are not going to solve the problem, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm avoiding your question, but
no. And if you don't mind, Stephanie, actually just building on what Zaid was saying here, I think it'd be quite interesting, especially because the Sustainable Food Lab is quite an interesting case study for this. That, as you were saying, sometimes the structural issues, they're not easy to address because they're kind of complex. But actually, the Sustainable Food Lab seems to have made some good headway. And I'm curious, how would you describe approaching this very complex structural issue? And how would you describe your relationship of the practice at Sustainable Food Lab and how it maybe had led to some of these improvements, just to kind of change the trajectory a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I can be of two minds. I can see, yeah, we're still around, so that's a success. Or, as you said, Zaid, we still have not fixed the food system, and some would argue actually around. It's gotten worse. And if you think about market consolidation or climate impacts, I mean, there's been some worsening of the problem. But I think one of the things we really focus on is this tension between the dance between experimentation and institutionalization. So, and because we're focused on the mainstream food and agriculture system, and we're really looking at market-led solutions, we're very clear that we're talking about market systems, about how food is traded, agricultural goods are traded, and we're really talking about that system. And most people recognize that there are broken parts of that system. The challenge, I think, comes when the institutional interests in keeping things in the sort of reinforcing loop that exists are stronger than those forces that want some experimentation. And even though they may be in that loop, they want to find a way to break it and innovate and experiment. And there's always that dance. And I think one of the things that has kept us around is the both understanding those institutional interests and roles of different actors, as well as a really deep network of trust, so that people, even if they don't believe it can change, if they're at the National Cattlemen's Association, hugely powerful institutional group, they're willing to come into a process. So I think cultivating the relationship is really important, while being, this is the tension, while recognizing that you can't have only the powerful in the room, that you have to carve out spaces and carve out some sense of safety for people to experiment. And I don't think we always get it right. And and we've had several different processes that have essentially failed. I hope we've learned from them, but because those institutional interests are really not, they were not interested in either accelerating or experimenting in a way that would shake the foundations of how trade was happening. And that's, I think, natural in our work. And if you're not butting up against that, I think that's something to say, okay, maybe you're not don't have the right conversations in the room. So I think if you hit those, that's kind of an, okay, we're on to something. It's that, I forget, Russ, how you said it, sort of the creative tension, or the sort of really using those as opportunity spaces as well. The other thing I just want to say, something that we do very explicitly is that we're a small organization. We are a membership network, so we have a small number of members, but we have consciously not grown as an organization, as a staff, because of the need. Once you're a big organization, you have an institutional agenda and staff you need to fund. And it's a very simple thing, and I know, but there's a number of other sort of peer organizations that have done this. As a small organization, we have the luxury of being emergent, being nimble. And I think social change practitioners, it's something to think about. Do you have to be part of a process because you have people's salary to support? And that's valid, but also recognizing that it will hamper you if you are sort of beholden to a certain institutional sort of funding structure. And it's not relevant for everybody, but it certainly has been part of our recipe.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, time's just flown by, but we've got quite a few questions from the audience. So if you don't mind just turning to those. So this question is around how do you reward the largest contributors in these types of these solutions? So the question is, if business products and services are actually solutions to complex human problems, how can one create a platform lab where contribution to new innovative solutions using the resources of multiple actors could reward those who make the largest contributions? Curious, whoever would like to answer that.
I can go. I mean, I think the issue is around, one way of framing it is that there's a question about incentives, which is that if you are an actor in the system that is producing a service or a strategy or product, whatever you want to call it, that is actually beneficial and helpful, how do you get rewarded for that? And I think that the market mechanism that we have, which is that we have pools of capital that are kind of buying solutions or incentivizing solutions, is kind of broken in a way. And it's broken because of our attitudes, if you like, or our understandings of risk, which is, how does capital actually deal with risk, and how do capital holders? So I would think specifically in terms of foundations, nonprofits, and governments, and then I would put corporations at the end of that. But how do they handle their capital in terms of investing in solutions to systemic challenges? So that marketplace of kind of supply and demand, I think, is kind of broken. And so as a result, I think a lot of the problems that we face as practitioners are partly because we're in a pretty dysfunctional marketplace. Yeah, so I think that there are questions about what are the rules of that marketplace, if you like, and what does it take to create not a new lab, I think, but a new marketplace where actually there are sufficient incentives for people to turn up and do the work, and they're rewarded for doing the work, whether that is actually putting in the labor or producing new products or services that actually have systemic kind of impacts. So how do we create that kind of marketplace, if you like? And I think it requires capital holders and capital to take to take a different view of how risk functions, which is that protecting institutions against risk is very different from systemic risk, and the risk to the system is quite different. You can protect yourself as an institution from risk, and actually systemic risk is kind of going up all the time and systems are collapsing, but you as an institution are, your donations are going up because people are worried about climate change, but actually, so as an institution, you're doing great, but the system is kind of collapsing, right, as a whole. So how do we create a new marketplace where people who are actually delivering real value and real solutions at a systemic level are rewarded and incentivized to do so?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Is there anything anyone else wants to add to that?
Clearly, yeah, this is Russ. Yep. Clearly, a lot of the work in market, supply chain, value chain kind of systems change initiatives is about shifting the incentives and disincentives and enabling adoption of new practices and policies. But there's also the element of how do you engage companies particularly to participate in this kind of process, which stands out to me because I was just updating a manual for a course. It's a very specialized course in how to engage stakeholders in these kinds of initiatives or processes. And one thing that stands out to me is the amount of insight and intelligence that companies get from participating in these labs and in these networks. It's a richness and diversity of understanding and particularly foresight that is difficult to get through other means, particularly as they're hearing about emerging issues from social stakeholders that their trade associations or professional groups haven't even really digested or started to understand. But also we've had a lot of company participants who say, participating in this network has changed the way I run my company or run my division. And that's really interesting to hear. So I think there are lots of reasons that people will participate in a process like this, but a lot of the work is about how do we provide assurance along the supply chain or value chain that we're getting the outcomes? How do we shift the incentives and disincentives? I think shifting the incentives and disincentives is the hardest part of the work.
Yeah. And so this is a question for Charlotte. What educational scaffolding was used to support innovation in your initiatives? So the person who asked this question is an educator, and she works with building technological supports for innovation for youth aged 13 to 18. So that's the context.
So is the question around the kind of infrastructure within the university that's needed to carry out such projects?
Yeah, and also kind of like the educational support and how do you approach that in terms of, yeah.
Great question, because it gets to the core of the issue when looking at, the intersection of everything we've been talking about with higher education, which is, can this topic even be introduced in a context of higher education without touching at the very system, without changing the system in which the education is given out? And of course, it's a complex topic because it's not. It has to be, in my experience, the only successful relationships that we have over long term with universities that want to bring in this aspect is that they take it as a strategic question for them. So actually, nicely, it links with what Russ was just saying just now, which is that there's an incentive for the university that's usually seen at the at the dean or at the provost or whatever the name is of the person at the top of that university, seeing the value in actually the university as a whole, as an institution, being in that dynamic. It doesn't mean that all faculty will take part in the experiment. That would be very far off. It's very difficult for it to happen because there's a lot of resistance to all these mindsets in the way that education is given out in most countries. Now we work in Morocco, in France, in the US, in California, and in London. So it's and Asia. So I mean, it's not. I don't see a cultural specificity on that. The fact is that in order to provide that kind of context for learning for students, where they can experiment with interdisciplinarity, with tackling big challenges, with going out of the silos of their disciplines, but also of the ways of learning that they are being taught, it does shake the institution. So there needs to be quite a lot of goodwill for that change to happen. We have done projects earlier on where I felt it was more cosmetic. So bringing that as a skill, again, as Zaid was saying, a set of tools or whatever, or a toolkit to students. I don't believe in that. For me, at least, I can't find any motivation in it. So it really is about the scaffolding in a way, and the visibility and the access to the university as a system that you have when doing that work. And in practice, it usually means having a direct channel with the dean or the provost or whoever is running strategically the organization, and being able to have an influence as well on not only the department in which you intervene, but some kind of influence on other faculty members, and on some of the questions of the future of learning, like how are all these processes significant, in fact, in the way that the university will survive, you know? And what's the link with how people learn and how people function? I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm aware we're out of time, but you know, and I feel like we had a lot to cover, you know, in quite a short space of time. But it does seem that I guess just as a point of conclusion, and I'd love to kind of pass if there are any kind of final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience, but that it's not easy kind of trying to create systemic change, and especially when you're bringing lots of different stakeholders together who may have different incentives and different kind of worldviews and views of the system. But at least what I take away from this is that I find it so encouraging that we have these different hubs, these different co-creation spaces, and something that you outlined so well in your book, Zaid, on social labs, that are different people that are building this practice in different areas. And you know, and we see this kind of this sharing, and I guess is that what we're doing here? We're sharing some of the learnings and the best practice, and it's something that I find very encouraging. So thank you. And yeah, was there any final thoughts before we closed?
I would just concur, Bowen, that this kind of iterative sharing is needed. So congrats on your work and continue to do it. It was really interesting to participate in.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah,
and just a thank you for convening this and bringing us together. So good to have the connections. Thank you.
This is brilliant. Well, yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for everyone for joining us at home. I hope it was it was thought-provoking, and just to mention as well, we have another webinar coming next week on Wednesday on the topic of systemic risks. So do come along for that as well. But thank you for all the speakers for joining us today. And yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you, Bowen.
Stay safe,
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.